Great. So hello, everybody, and welcome to our third session of Outside the Rails. This time we are joined by Lynne Lund. Lynne is our environment critic. I guess your critic role might get a little bit of a change in name now that the that the department's been reorganized, won't it, Lynne?
It will be an interesting conversation for sure.
Interesting. Yes, if you haven't been following the news, there was a cabinet shuffle earlier this morning, and we now have a Ministry of Environment, Energy, and Climate Action. So they dropped the water bit and did some other little changes there. So Lynne is going to be sharing with us today some work that she's doing to prepare a bill on an environmental bill of rights for Prince Edward Island. So that's really exciting. I know I'm looking forward to learning more about what an environmental bill of rights will mean for us and for our environment, obviously. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit now about how the session is going to flow today. So first of all, we're going to give Lynne some time to present what she's been working on. What is an environmental bill of rights, and how is she going to encode that in legislation? Then we're going to have time to open up for questions that people might have, specifically to clarify, anything that Lynne said, or any outstanding questions that you might have about the Environmental Bill of Rights. And then we open up from there into general discussion. So you can still ask questions if you have them, but also Lynne is seeking your feedback as well, your suggestions and your feedback. That's what this is all about. So, so we're going to really be encouraging that. We've got a lot of people joining us right now. There's already, well, now 24 and climbing. And so I would really encourage you to use the raise hand function on Zoom to indicate if you want to speak, if you want to say something or ask a question, just so that we can keep some kind of sense of order and make sure that everybody gets a chance to speak who wants to. If you're not familiar with the raise hand function on Zoom, you'll see a little button called Reactions. It'll be right next to where you'd usually see the chat button. And under Reactions, one of the things you can do there is raise your hand. And then that way I'll see it and I'll call on you to speak. And in case you can't find the chat function, I am going to just write something in the chat right now. And if you don't know where the chat function is, you'll probably see something light up in orange. There go. Lynne's quick in responding, and so you'll see the orange flashing there, and that indicates where you can find the chat function on the device that you're joining us from. Okay. I also would really encourage you to make good use of the chat. So the great thing about the chat is that even if we might not have time for everything that they want to say, or maybe there's just a little thing that you want to kind of get in while somebody else is speaking, you can do that on the chat, and we're going to be able to export the chat and provide that to Lynne after this, so that even if she's not able to keep up with everything that you're saying, we'll have a written record of all of your suggestions. And we also have Chris Marlon Pereira is joining us today as our volunteer live blogger. So what he's going to do is try to take some quick notes when people are saying things, providing suggestions, asking questions, in order to help to get that on the record in our chat. So thank you very much for doing that, Chris Marlon. Okay, so I'm going to, without any further ado then, turn it over to Lynne. Lynne, can you please tell us about your bill?
I would love to. First of all, thank you so much for hosting this, Jordan, and Chris Marlon for volunteering tonight. I really appreciate this. And thank you to everyone who gave up some time to come and listen to me talk about my bill. Having the opportunity to engage with members is one of my favorite things. So I thank you for this. I suppose I'm going to start with my why I am working on an environmental bill of rights. I started last summer working on this, and basically the result of it was so many decisions that I have seen taken that I found frustrating. I would point to the pathway that was put through a sand dune, which was an obviously bad decision. That was obviously not okay for that ecosystem. But it happened and it was done. And once it was done, people found out about it and they were upset. But what can you do to fix it once it's been destroyed, right? Or you can think of the building permit that was approved in a wetland. That's crazy to me, but the permit was already in place and the building was already happening. And that's very frustrating, but I even think of things that islanders know that are happening, like Plan B. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. We are going to put a superhighway through an old growth Acadian forest. And islanders were frustrated and they spoke up about it and they were engaged before that highway was built. But so many people felt like consultation on that was government telling the public what their plan was, and the plan was going to happen either way. So that was sort of the catalyst for why I wanted to work on an environmental bill of rights. I kept seeing these piecemeal examples of having to deal with problems case by case as they were coming up, but there was no overarching framework in place that said, number one, island and a biodiverse ecosystem, there's nowhere that says that that water and that land intact is our right. And there's also nowhere that says islanders have the right to participate in decision making. So I was looking for tools that, number one, we're not going to solve every environmental problem on Prince Edward Island. Those of you who have been around this issue know it's complicated and it's probably going to take a lot of legislation before we are at that point. But this was a really broad, sweeping, good tool that would prevent a lot of problems in the future. So I was looking at our legislation that we have now, the Environmental Protection Act, and frankly, I just didn't feel like it had the teeth. We looked at the possibility of amending it. Would there be changes I could make to the act as it exists that would really bolster it up? But I just didn't feel like there were. So I started looking to other jurisdictions to find how they had solved this problem. And there are actually a few examples, even in Canada, of an environmental bill of rights. So I was able to find examples in Quebec since the 70s. I've been able to find the Yukon and Northwest Territories, and most recently, but it was still in the 90s, Ontario brought in an environmental bill of rights. So there was certainly precedent that this was a good way to go. I was able to look at examples of how it had worked in that case. But what is an environmental bill of rights? What does that even mean? And here's the thing, it's actually quite a substantive piece of legislation. By the time it's done, it's going to be a little more than 20 pages, if I were to guess. It's a big bill. And it does a lot of things, but I'll try to unpack them, hopefully on time. And I might take a little longer because it is complicated, but I want to make sure everybody follows me here. So the first thing, thank you. The first thing it will do is enshrine in rights our right to a healthy environment, our right to a healthy ecosystem, and not just today's generation, but future generations. It enshrines the right of future islanders to a healthy environment, which we define as clean air, clean water, all of that. It's very detailed. That whole section is quite detailed. It establishes the right of islanders to participate in decision-making about the environment, and it codifies like certain levels of minimum levels that government must do to engage the public and solicit feedback. Another thing it does is creates an environmental commissioner who is an independent third-party office that's going to be responsible for overseeing the act, implementing the act, making sure government is respecting all of the rights that are now bound in legislation. And then, of course, issuing reports back to the House on how the government is doing, looking over their actions. That commissioner will be able to provide advice to ministers on how to make sure the decisions they are making are compliant with islanders' rights. And that office will also be available to islanders who wish to participate in decision-making that's happening on the environment. It will give plain language instructions on how to do that and how to make your case, what you need to do. That office is there to help islanders engage in that process. So another thing it does is creates an environmental registry where projects that are coming forward will be listed. That registry must be online. It can also have a written copy of it, but it has to be available online. That's in legislation if we pass this. And it includes specific things. It has to include details about the project, when you have to provide commentary until how to get in contact with the commissioner if you have questions. It just lays out all of the details and how you engage with it, tells you your time frame to do that. And the other thing it does is enshrines the right for islanders to sue if government fails to protect your environmental rights. So that's pretty substantive. That's a big deal. And frankly, getting it passed will be an interesting challenge. But those are sort of the high level ideas of what an EDR is. But I'd like to just walk through, for example, what that could look like so that you can imagine yourself engaging with this process. So when I think of Plan B, for example, that highway, that's one we're all really familiar with. I assume, maybe I shouldn't assume that, but it's a tangible example. So now we have an environmental bill of rights. We have a commissioner who is responsible for making sure that registry is up to date and islanders are able to engage with it. So I am looking at the government's registry, and I see that the Department of Transportation is planning to put a highway through an area in Bansha, and I am aware that that is an old growth Acadian forest, and I'm concerned about it. So my first level of engaging with it might be I would reach out to the commissioner and ask, how can I submit comments on this? I have a lot to say about why this is problematic, and I want to let the government know that this isn't okay. So the commissioner is going to give me feedback on how to do that, where I can submit in writing my comments to. So I do that during the public participation stage of it. Great. So two things are going to happen. Number one, now the engagement period is over and the final proposal is going to come forward. So I can review that proposal, and in the best case scenario, the feedback of islanders has been incorporated, the path of that road has been changed, and I'm happy. That's the end of what I need to do. But if that doesn't happen, now I can go to step two. I can apply for a review of this project before it goes forward. So in order to do that, I need two people to agree with me. So I'm person A, and I need to talk to person B. I need one other person to also think this is problematic. And if I'm able to find two people, myself and one others, who is concerned about this, I can write to the commissioner asking for this decision by government to be reviewed. And now the commissioner will receive that application for review, and they're going to read through it, and they're going to compare it to the rights that are currently enshrined for PEI. And if the commissioner decides, yes, this is indeed a concern, I'm going to get my written decision back saying, yep, the rights of islanders are indeed being infringed upon. The right of this forest is an ecosystem for future generations, and it's important. Okay, so I've got that written decision. So now the commissioner will reach out to the ministry that she believes is most appropriate to deal with the issue. So in this case, it's going to be transportation. They are going to send their review, their written decision to that minister and say, hey, minister, so you know, there is public consultation on this that suggests it's problematic. I've reviewed this document and this proposal. I also think it's problematic. I need to make recommendations on how you can change this project to be compliant with the Environmental Bill of Rights that Prince Edward Island has adopted. Great. So now the minister is going to receive that. And the next thing that will happen, they're going to receive that, they're going to go through it. And they have three options at that point. The transportation minister can adapt the project to be compliant with the Bill of Rights. They can write back to the commissioner and attempt to justify why they believe the commissioner's decision is incorrect and see if they can change the commissioner's mind. Or three, they can choose to go ahead with it, but if they do, they know islanders have the right to take them to court. So if they go ahead without having made any changes, and person A, myself, I'm still dissatisfied with this, I have the ability to pursue legal action. because my environmental rights are not being respected. The ministers had ample opportunity along the way to de-escalate, and they did not. At that point, the judge has the opportunity to review the file, review the Environmental Bill of Rights, the decision that was put forward by the commissioner, and now I can sue government. So this is quite progressive, but I will tell you that the ability to sue government does exist in Ontario and other places. This is not out of nowhere. Whether or not we will be able to convince the party in power that they should bring forward such legislation, well, let's see. We don't have a majority on our own, so we will need support from others. But essentially, an Environmental Bill of Rights gives us the ability to participate in the decisions that are being made that affect us. It's not a catch-all. It doesn't touch decisions that are made on your private property. If you decide you want to cut down trees that are in your backyard, I don't have any authority over that. It's predominantly public land that this is happening on, or public resources. It doesn't solve every problem. I wish it did, but it will definitely be a tool that will aid us in so many circumstances moving forward. All of the projects that I just mentioned, the building permit in a wetland, the sand dune, the Plan B, none of these projects would have likely gone through if we would have had these tools. So that's the overview in a couple of minutes on what an EBR is. And if I've missed anything, I would love to answer any clarifying questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Lynn. So yeah, a reminder, if you have any questions, you have a couple of options. You can use the raise hand function found in the reactions part of your Zoom toolbar to raise your hand and get on the speakers list, so we can ensure that everybody who wants to ask a question can get in there. And you can also ask your questions through the chat, which I see that some people have already started to do. And I'll bring those out to Lynn as well. So just to get started, I see that David had asked a question about the rights of the environment, and I know that there are some precedents for this. He mentioned Pachamama. I think that's a reference to Bolivia, which has actually given rights to Mother Nature, and people can sue on behalf of the environment. How would you compare an environmental bill of rights to that kind of legislation?
So I'm sure there are some similarities, but this does not enshrine the rights of nature in and of themselves. It enshrines the rights to a healthy environment for people. Frankly, I had seen examples like this, but my main struggle there is the belief that I can get it passed. So I feel like enshrining in rights, our right to a healthy environment, to healthy ecosystems, to clean air, to clean water, to healthy soils, that would be a huge change from the way that we look at resources on PEI currently. And because there are precedents of this already in Canada, I feel like I have a much better time arguing. You know, they did this in Ontario. They're currently looking at it in Nova Scotia. We have seen this in the territories. We've seen this in Quebec. Being able to point to other jurisdictions that are close, that are doing something so similar, feels like an important first step in this.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that, Lynn. Bob has a question there. He mentions that 3 people seems like a small number, right? So 2 others in addition to the main proponent? No, oh, sorry, 2.
Person
Okay.
A and person B, myself and one other person. So it's a really fair point.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, it would be one I would be willing to consider reviewing. But what I didn't want to happen was it to be a difficult number to attain that would make it hard for a person to move forward with this. And I think about the water bottling facility that had been proposed in Brookvale. Mm-hmm. And at the time, the proponent, in order to be compliant with the legislation, had to send around a letter to people within so many meters of the proposed project. And that actually only ended up being one person. So getting one person enthusiastic about moving forward on this would have been easy. For them to have to solicit a lot of support if they needed 50 other people, there was no one in the neighborhood who it would have impacted also. So I wanted to set it at a threshold that I did not feel was unattainable. The commissioner does have the right to look over it and say, you know what, honestly, this is not going any further. This is not an infringement of your environmental rights. I looked at the legislation. I understand your concern, but this doesn't catch that. So not everything ends up going to the ministers. Not everything gets escalated up, but I don't want it to be difficult for people to be able to move forward with getting an opinion from the commissioner.
Okay.
Does that answer
And
your
just
question?
thanks. So Bob, you can let us know if that that answers your question or not. And just related to that, Lynn, I know that in many environmental assessment processes, there are requirements for people to, you know, be directly affected or meet some kind of criteria that allows them to intervene in a development project that's being proposed, for example. Do you have anything like that in your? So anybody in the island could raise a concern about something happening anywhere on the island, basically.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, they absolutely can. That doesn't mean it's going to move forward, but it does mean the commissioner will review it and give you an opinion on whether or not our environmental rights have been infringed upon.
Okay, thanks. And I see that Don Mazer has his hand up. So Don, please ask your question.
Thank you, Jordan. I just want to clarify something, Lynn. I thought I heard you say that this applies only to public projects that take place on public land. Would this not also apply to private projects where people have concerns that their environmental rights are being violated or the rights of nature are being violated as these projects go forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, Don, and I may not have been super clear about that, so I appreciate you asking. So it's not just public projects on public land. It's not just the things that happen in the Department of Transportation or permits through the Environment Department, but that would be a big chunk of it. However, if you are a private homeowner and you want to cut down trees on your property, this doesn't give me the right to stop you from cutting down trees on your property. But for a new development, anything you would need a permit for, those permits essentially are now going to end up on this environmental registry. Anything that I need to contact the department, whether it would go through the Environmental Assessment Act or excuse me, Environmental Protection Act, anything that would require permitting in the first place, including, by the way, very basic projects that the TIE department is moving forward on. All of that would end up on the registry. But if I was going to do any major new development that requires that, it's going to go up there anyway. What it doesn't do is say, hey, now you can't do this thing you've already been doing on your own property. It doesn't tell my neighbors that they can't use cosmetic pesticides if the city bylaws don't do that. Nothing that requires nothing that doesn't require a new permit, essentially.
Okay.
However,
Sorry.
the other part of this that I forgot to mention, and now that you've brought this up, it reminds me, the other part of an EDR that is useful is if you believe any existing legislation, any existing regulations, any existing policies, anything like that, any government tools that exist, if you think there is a part of it that now that we have this EDR, it infringes on my environmental rights, you and one other person can write to the commissioner to have that reviewed too. And the commissioner may say, hey, this product you've always been allowing is in fact an infringement on people's environmental rights. This way of doing business that you've always done thing is problematic. And moving forward, you're going to have to change that commission. You're going to have to change that practice or that policy or that piece of legislation to bring it in alignment.
Okay.
So that's the other component of it. It gives us the opportunity to go back over old policies and old things that we've allowed and update them in the light of this EBR.
Can I ask one other question while I have you about a
Please.
different topic? do you have any provisions for what they call SLAPP or anti-SLAPP
Yep,
um, to,
SLAPP legislation.
to
So
protect whistleblowers from frivolous suits being raised by people who are trying to stop them?
sure do. One of the things that we did while we were putting this together is consult with East Coast Environmental Law. And they're in Nova Scotia and they're fabulous. I mean, they're just incredibly informed on this topic. And that was one of the things that they brought up. They gave us some advice on how to change the language of our bill so that it would protect someone from SLAPP legislation, from scare tactics, from a big business or big corporation coming with a countersuit to try to intimidate me from exercising my environmental rights.
Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions, Don. So we've got a bunch of questions coming in the chat now. So with regards to the lawsuits, Alexander raises an interesting point there. He asks, you know, how can we make the offender accountable? Suing the government means suing myself. It doesn't hurt the offender, and you would need to find a lawyer from outside of PEI, probably. So, Lynn, can you speak to that? Why would the government have an incentive to not be sued? And do you think that it would be difficult? There would be a huge hurdle for people to sue the government based on that.
So it's a really fair question, and I don't have a perfect answer for that. But the reality is, this wouldn't just allow you to challenge governments. It does allow you to challenge corporations. It does allow you to challenge others. But having a final outcome that knows government can end up in court is what gives it teeth. And even though I expect the amount of instances where government will not take one of the 4 exits to de-escalate the situation, I assume that in most circumstances, we're not going to go there, because it's not like my environmental rights have been infringed upon. Step 1, sue government. That's definitely not intended to be the pathway, because that doesn't benefit anyone. But if I don't have a or else this, then there's really nothing to hold government to account on that. So when government is bringing forward a plan on something and the public gives their feedback, and overwhelmingly they are concerned about the direction this project is going in, but government ignores us anyway. And then we write to the commissioner and have 10 people who want this project reviewed. And the commissioner reviews it and says, yes, the environmental rights of islanders are being infringed upon. I am going to let the minister know my decision. And the minister looks at it and says, I hear from the public, I hear from the commissioner, I don't care. I'm doing it anyway. If you don't have the and then legislation is going to tell me I can take this to court, then this doesn't have any teeth. When we did consultation with watershed groups and with community organizations and so many environmental groups, that was a key piece of feedback. Do you think the right to sue has to be included in this? I'd have an easier time passing this without that included. But everyone, literally every group I consulted with said, if this doesn't have a and then this, then it's just, if you want to protect my environmental rights, there has to be a something at the end of it that matters. So how access to justice, I think it's a really valid point. I think there are certainly components of it. I am definitely willing to look at advice people have on how to make access to justice better for people. But yeah, I see Cindy Richards' comment about anti-SLAPP legislation, and that's part of this bill. It's included in it. But if people have ideas on how to better improve access to justice through this bill, I'm really interested in hearing it.
And Lynn, perhaps you can clarify as well, when you talk about suing the government, should we be envisioning people suing for, financial compensation because their rights are being violated? Or would it be more like suing for a court order ordering the government to change its decision?
To change its direction or repair damage to a reasonable degree. There are actually 8 different potential outcomes. It's not for people to get rich from it, but it's finding ways to mitigate what has happened if it's already gone through. It's reversing decisions. It's to force certain outcomes, not for financial. Perhaps in some rare circumstances that would be the case, but by and large, I do not expect that to be the outcome.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Before I go to the next questions, and I'll just encourage you to keep those hands going up and the questions coming in through the chat too, if you prefer that way. And I know we have at least one person joining us by phone, and I know that you can't raise your hand when you're joining by phone. So if you have a question, please don't be afraid to butt in with your voice, and we'll be happy to hear from you. So Ola posed a question a little earlier, which probably a lot of people are would be wondering about. What about next door spraying toxic pesticide in a field?
It is a question that I've gotten a lot, and this is the thing. Because applying pesticides is not currently illegal on Prince Edward Island, we have a Pesticide Application Act that goes through all of that. So currently, I could not sue my neighbor for such a thing. I could not say he or she is infringing on my environmental rights. What you could possibly do is ask the commissioner to review whether our pesticide laws need to be updated to reflect our environmental Bill of Rights. That would be a possibility. What the outcome would be from that, I couldn't say, but no farmers need to be worried that the result of this is tomorrow your neighbor is going to say, you're infringing on my environmental rights, and you specifically are going to be financially accountable for it. But there is a distinct possibility that people could make a case that government needs to update their approach.
Right, so this could be sort of compared to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, where you're not saying, you know, Lynn, you're violating my rights, you know, under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. What you're saying is, you know, the government is violating it, or the government is not adequately, you know, does not have laws that are protecting me and my rights.
Exactly.
Okay. Cool. Thank you for that. Barbara Dillo was asking, what influence would the Environmental Bill of Rights have on invasive species? So I guess, I don't know, Barbara, do you want to clarify your question? Is it, you know, is it about a right to, you know, to get rid of invasive species or prevent them from coming into the island?
Yeah, thanks. Just because of what Lynn just replied to about the pesticides. So yes, I can clarify. So it means also in terms of invasive species, for instance, the Japanese knotweed. If a neighbor has Japanese knotweed growing on their property and it's growing on mine, I'm controlling on my side, but they're not controlling on theirs. And this is an actual case. I guess it's the same thing. The Invasive Species Act would have to be updated. Is that right, Lynn?
Exactly. Absolutely. So
that means that there are any number of acts that might have to be reviewed, including the Species at Risk Act, including probably the MGA.
You know, there are just so many pieces of legislation that islanders could potentially ask for a review of if we are lucky enough to get this in place. That's the truth. And it gives us tools to start moving forward on some of those other issues that have been problematic to islanders for years. It doesn't guarantee us a specific outcome on it. The bill itself doesn't immediately mean this is the impact of it, but it means we now have a pathway to ask for changes from the environmental perspective. So
okay, I just have a follow-up question to that, because right now there seems to be a disconnect between the city of Charlottetown and the provincial side of things. So then that applies also. How will Charlottetown, the city of Charlottetown, be affected, or how will the EBR influence the city of Charlottetown when already there seems to be a disconnect between what the city does and what the government is either planning or aspiring to do, etc.?
It's such a good question, Barbara. And I think you answered it in your earlier part, that potentially the Municipal Governance Act would be something that a person could ask the commissioner. In fact, because of the way this interacts with this, do the way that rezoning permits are issued need to be considered. You know, it's a real question, and it's a really good point. It is certainly something that would be a possibility. What the outcome of it would be, it's hard for me to say, but I certainly think it would be worth getting one other person to submit a review on.
Oh, I'd get enough people to review that one.
I have no doubt.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So, Lynn, Cindy brought up a really good question. She asks, "Are Indigenous rights being included?" And she read my mind, because what you were describing with your environmental bill of rights sounds very similar to the duty to consult that the federal government and provincial governments has with First Nations to ensure that their Aboriginal rights are being respected, and treaty rights, which often look very much like, you know, rights to enjoy a healthy environment. And so can you speak to that? Like, are Indigenous rights specifically referenced in your bill, or how would they sort of interact with Indigenous and treaty rights?
It's an awesome question. So there are actually a number of sections that specifically reference environmental rights. It talks about UNDRIP legislation. It talks about the environmental racism that other cultures, particularly Indigenous people, have dealt with on Prince Edward Island, that a right to a healthy environment is important to their culture, and that has to be included in it. So yes, we have quite significant references and cross-references to Indigenous rights, one section of it. I don't know how well that will format. And that's just a section of it, but the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People affirms Indigenous people's rights to a healthy environment. The government of Prince Edward Island recognizes the value of implementing that declaration provincially. There are a whole bunch of parts through it. That was certainly something we reached out to the Onway on to get feedback, ask them if they would like to be consulted on us bringing this forward. Onway, for those of you who are not familiar, is the Indigenous Rights Initiative on PEI. So that's a really important component for me personally.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. And keep those questions coming, everybody. You know,
I wish I
one
could
thing.
share the whole.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Jordan. I was just going to say, I really wish that I could share the whole piece of legislation with all of you, so you could read through it and see the various components. But I've sent it off to the Legislative Council, and they haven't returned it back to me yet as a printed document. So I just have like hand typed notes that have probably been changed since then. But big chunks of it I can show you. It's just I don't have a whole thing, or I would share it.
Okay, well, thank you, Lynn. We understand, and hopefully hopefully that will come back from the Legislative Council soon, and we'll be able to share it with everyone. You know, so and I think Barbara there mentioned, you know, this could be a really great catalyst, and Toby was saying this could potentially give islanders a voice. And I'm wondering if you see the potential that there can be a lot of requests coming forward by a lot of very excited people hoping to make some long overdue changes to how our environment is protected on PEI, and you know, what kinds of resources this environment commissioner might need in order to avoid the risk of being, you know, bogged down.
Yeah, so there's a whole section of the Act that deals with the creation of the Office of the Commissioner, that the Commissioner gets its funding from the Legislative Assembly, that the Legislative Management Committee has the ability to review whether or not the office is adequately resourced. It allows for the Commissioner to hire people if the Commissioner believes that there is a need for more help and more support. There are provisions for the Commissioner to ensure that will be there.
Okay, so kind of like elections, PEI has a statutory spending authority where they can spend whatever they need to deliver good elections. Basically, the commissioner would have a similar type of authority.
That is my intention, certainly. I want to make sure that this office is able to be as effective as they need to be. And there are budgetary requirements laid out for them. They can apply for additional funding if it's required. And there are a number of steps for that are laid out in the bill, but I don't have those components committed exactly to memory.
And
I
how,
couldn't
how does
find it for
that
you.
how does that compare with the Auditor General in terms of their powers and their budget or ability to spend what they need to?
So because I am a private member, I cannot assign a dollar value to any piece of legislation that I'm
Right.
doing. So I cannot say the commissioner's office will be given X amount of money. I cannot do that. But I can say that they need to be able to be funded by the Legislative Assembly, and that the same process that exists for all of the other independent commissions that we have, like the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate and all of those things, that this would be treated and funded in the same manner as a existing and comparable office. But
Mhm.
I cannot compel government to spend money in as such.
Yes, of course. And that's a very good thing for people to understand the limitations of power when you're not in government. Can't spend the money. I'm going to go to a question from Glenn Grant, and then we'll go to Dawn after Glenn. So Glenn, go ahead with your question, please.
Hi, Lynn.
Hello, how are you?
Nice to see you, neighbor.
Nice to see you, Glenn.
So I was thinking about people who want to sue the government, so to speak. I think you're right. There has to be and then attached to the legislation or to the bill. I agree 100%. I'm thinking that the government has very deep pockets and probably has lots of legal services that I, as an individual, would not be privy to. So perhaps somewhere along the line, one could make an argument that if we get to a point where this case now is looking at going to the courts, perhaps the person who's bringing it to the courts, if they are acting on behalf of the public and there's merit to the case, perhaps now some kind of legal funding can be made available to that party or that one individual. Of course, that would have to be reviewed very carefully, and it would have to be done under certain restrictions. But just a suggestion, I know I wouldn't want to sue the government because I'm retired and I thought I might like to eat on a regular basis, right? So that's just a comment on that. Now, I have another question, or I have a question for you. Is you said that this bill applies only to public land. That's correct?
So not exclusively, but projects that would be requiring a permit. So if I'm cutting down a tree in my backyard, you don't have the right to stop me from doing so, even if that's frustrating. But if my neighbor owns a piece of land that is a wetland, and I apply to the Department of Environment for a building permit to put up a property in that wetland, even though it's on my private property, because that is now considered something that I required a permit for, that would have to go on the registry. I would have the right to engage in, wait a minute, that permit should never have been issued. And I can see that a wetland is a very delicate ecosystem, and I'm going to write in about it. So I would have the ability to interact with that decision because the wetland is a public good.
Would the body that's issuing the license, would they, before I even get involved personally, would the body who issues the license do a review of our rights before they even issue that license? So you're not in an after the act
Exactly.
mode, that would happen?
Exactly,
Oh, okay.
Yes, because
Good.
that's the intention for certain. So there is a minimum amount of time that the public has to have to participate in decisions that are going to impact them. It's 30 days in most cases. So if I was going to put this permit up and I had any reason to believe that it could be controversial, it could be ecologically sensitive, the only time something doesn't land on the registry is if the minister can say that they think they have absolutely no reason to be concerned about this. It's not environmentally sensitive. This is the sort of project that goes forward all the time. We do this constantly. We're putting in a new driveway in someone's yard and there's no waterway around. Okay, fine. If I want to make that discretion that these types of projects don't apply, the minister always has the power to prevent that. But if the public sees a project like that, go ahead and like that actually should have been on there, the minister has the recourse of having to deal with the environmental commissioner, then writing that decision up. And the public can move forward on it. So it will be very rare that something, it would have to be like the sort of small, I am removing a tree stump on public land and there's no waterway around it, right? We don't want to get bogged down in every single tiny, minute detail.
No, I understand that.
There, but
to be honest, I wasn't thinking about that so much as I was thinking about drilling wells for ponds. And I remember we went on a tour last year and looked at all the ponds that was being built by the Irving family. And so that's what I was thinking, well, that's private land. They can do whatever the hell they like. They can build as many ponds as they like. So this would preempt that kind of construction. Is that correct?
yeah, it absolutely would, because that pond, even though it's on someone's land, it will be accessing the shared aquifer and the rights to water. That's not your property anymore.
Thank you.
So,
and I guess that was the point I was going to actually get to. Is that's fine, it's private property, but the resource should be viewed as public. You know.
I agree. And
thank
resources.
You.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for the questions.
Okay, thank you, Glenn. And we'll go to Don. I know Don's active in the water scene here, but I'm not sure if that's going to be his question.
Well, I mean, that last point was really quite interesting, like about whether or not can you sue the government for inaction, for example, in order to allow a various, you know, creating situations where people are allowed to damage the environment. The holding ponds is a perfect example of that. So while the government has, you know, not proclaimed the Water Act or its regulations, it's created a wonderful opportunity for all of these holding ponds to be constructed, which are kind of outside the spirit of the Water Act and the pending regulations, and yet there's no control over that because of the fact that this legislation hasn't been proclaimed, which wasn't the point I was going to raise. So I'll leave that. I'll go to one other thing. I'm looking at the draft of the Nova Scotia legislation that East Coast Environmental Law was involved in developing, and I'm seeing that they have, you know, certain guiding principles related to the implementation of the act or interpretation of the act. And I know you mentioned one. It sounds like intergenerational equity is one of the things that you were thinking of, but they also have references to the precautionary principle and polluter pays principle. So I was wondering if any of principles like that are part of the way that you framed this act.
That's a great question. We absolutely took a lot of what the Nova Scotia Bill of Rights had in it and moved forward with it. So polluter pay principle, absolutely. Intergenerational equity, absolutely. The fact that these laws cannot be regressive, we cannot establish rights for the environment and then move them back in the future. Once they're there, they're ours. A whole bunch of the guiding principles that are in the Nova Scotia Bill are in ours too. I think all of them are, to be honest. Yeah, they were fantastic to work with. East Coast Environmental Law knows their stuff.
And while I have you, let me say one more thing so I don't interrupt again. And this is wonderful what you're doing, because there's there's kind of a history of working on this issue going back to the Blue Dot, and it came into play when the Water Act was being developed, because there was a thought that maybe this would be an opportunity for an environmental Bill of Rights, and kind of a decision that was made that since water is on the table, that we will kind of try and get in the back door and try and get a right to water established as an environmental right in the Water Act. We were unsuccessful. That isn't there. So it's terrific that this is happening. And I want to invite people to the ECO PEI annual general meeting on the 23rd of February, which is going to feature a discussion of environmental rights and an environmental Bill of Rights. And Tina Northrup from East Coast Environmental Law, who might be on the list of people who are at this meeting today, will be speaking, as well as Nino Andatse from the UPEI Environmental Studies program. And I think the meeting will be online in just like 2 days before the legislature opens. So hopefully it will be a fruitful discussion. Everybody's invited to attend. We certainly would love to have the people in the legislature come to attend and hear, and everybody else. I think it's
I'd love to go, Dawn. Would you mind emailing me the invitation to that? I'd love to be there. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. That's very timely. And yeah, so we have just under 10 minutes left, and we've got some good questions here kind of about next steps. So that's probably a perfect thing to sort of segue into. So first of all, Sally was wondering, what are the next steps for this from here? Are you intending to present this in the next session?
Yeah, I absolutely am. So here's the thing I should say before I say that specifically. I expect the bill to be ready to go in the next session, but because we are the opposition, the amount of time that we get to bring forward our legislation is limited. We generally have, I want to say, 120 minutes in a week to debate our stuff. And when I made my very first amendment to the Climate Leadership Act, which the change was changing the number from 0.4 to 0.2. That was the change. It was this big. And I spent 3.5 days in the legislature defending my bill. I had been in the House for 3 days at that point, and it was terrifying. But it took hours to get this one minor change through. And if we were to find ourselves with a similar amount of scrutiny on a 20-page bill, there plainly would not be time for anyone else in my caucus to bring forward anything in the next sitting. So what bills are going to come forward is hard to say. I will be tabling this in the next sitting for sure, but I believe there are 7 or 8 pieces of legislation that my colleagues and I are all working on, and we all want to be able to bring ours. We all think ours is the most important. I definitely think mine is, and Hannah for sure thinks hers is, and so does Trish. So I can't say for sure that I will get to bring it forward. I certainly intend to try. The House closes whenever government's business is done, and not when opposition's business is done. So I fully expect some of us will not get all the way to the floor with our legislation this sitting. If we don't, we'll bring it back the next time. We fully intend to do it. It is my expressed intention to do this, but I don't want to mislead you. If I'm not able to, I won't, but I'm certainly going to try.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. And we've got a couple of questions from Toby and Claudia, basically wondering how we can help and support this initiative.
Yes.
And should we be contacting our MLAs?
Yes. Yes. I am going to need help. I would not have passed my climate leadership bill if it were not for the fact that we had a group of young people take a microphone and stand up at a rally that we held outside the legislature and explain to government MLAs who had already told me they were voting against my bill that their rights to a safe planet superseded the government's discomfort with this issue. So I know for a fact that I'm not going to be able to pass this without help. Please write letters to your MLA. Please consider putting letters to the editor. Please consider making this part of the conversation, because without government feeling like Islanders care about this, they have no reason to want to bring this in. This does not benefit government, it benefits Islanders. So I need your help.
Great. So
I want your
maybe we can work on getting some information out to people so that they can you know, to help people, give people the tools basically to advocate for this and tell other people about it and why it's important.
I definitely will need help on this. I have a very strong belief that getting this passed is going to be a challenge. And I actually have had a number of groups that I consulted with on this say to me, we are so excited you're bringing this forward. We commend you for doing it. You're going to have a hell of a battle. I honestly don't think it's possible for you to pass it, but I wish you luck. And yeah, I'm going to need your help.
We've heard that before, right? Yeah. So, and Chris raises a question here about one of the hurdles that you might come up against, you know, when you're debating this in the legislature, having to do with the cost And so she's wondering if you've tried to cost out what the commissioner would cost even informally to address that. And also, what would you say if they say, well, we already have environmental impact legislation, to take care of that.
So our environmental impact legislation sounds great until you look at it. That would be a very hard case for someone to put forward in a compelling way. Even what triggers an environmental assessment is unbelievably high. Yes, that's a really good point, and I appreciate Chris playing devil's advocate on this one. I think we in our office are already creating lists of all of the arguments that we expect to hear in preparation for this. I don't like going to the floor unprepared, so I will definitely be expecting these sorts of things. Have I costed out the commission's office yet informally? No, I haven't, but that's a great idea. I could certainly look at comparable offices, and I appreciate you bringing that forward. There are a few that are similar, and we could also look at like how many cases actually make their way to the commissioner in Ontario and get a sense of how that can be dealt with. When they decided to remove the commissioner's office in Ontario, they gave that responsibility to the Auditor General to oversee. And we had originally considered that, but I thought, you know what, let's ask for the best case scenario. And if this became the sticking point, then you know what, I'm going to do the best I can to get through the most of this possible, but I'd rather have rights than have perfect or nothing,
Mm-hmm.
So we will be, I think that's a good idea to cost that out, but we are definitely preparing for all kinds of silly arguments.
Great. And actually, I just remembered that I had missed a question up earlier, wanting some clarification on the commissioner, basically being a third party independent officer of the legislature, right? So they would report to the legislature as a whole and not to the government.
That's right. They report to the speaker.
Okay.
So it's exactly, the creation of this office is exactly the same process that a privacy commissioner or a child and youth advocate or any of those other independent arm's length offices are brought forward. It would be the same process.
Okay, so the government wouldn't be able to fire them if they didn't like what they were doing. They would that would basically the legislature would need to fire them.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, you've got it.
That's good to know.
And the other thing that I am doing, to Chris's point, I'm having conversations one-to-one with other MLAs and other caucuses. And that's something I generally do when I'm trying to get legislation forward. I'm reaching out privately and informally saying, hey, this is what I'm doing. If you have any concerns, let's talk them through and see if I can answer any of your questions so that this isn't a shock to anyone. I'm offering every MLA briefings on it so we can go through it in detail. They can have their staff sit down with me. I can answer questions before we hit the floor so that I at least have a good idea what the main concerns are. I have a number of MLAs that I have really productive working relationships with, so I'm going to do my best. But if those MLAs are also hearing from people in their districts, well, a lot.
Yeah. And I guess another question that I'd have around that is how do you see the cabinet shuffle potentially making it, harder or easier to get legislation like this passed? I mean, you have a new environment minister to deal with.
I do. For those of
Yeah.
you who haven't heard, the new environment minister is Stephen Myers. And I am willing to bet that at least some of you would be surprised to know that Stephen and I have a very productive working relationship. I reached out to Stephen when I wanted to bring forward my last piece of legislation, my net zero carbon bill, and told him what I was working on. He expressed to me 2 concerns on it and asked if I would accept friendly amendments. I told him I cheerfully would. They were minor. I was really happy with them. He tabled those amendments, told his caucus he was supportive, and it passed in like 20 minutes. And it was a brand new piece of legislation and was way bigger than that tiny amendment that I debated for days. I don't feel like Stephen Myers would not be willing to consider this. I think Stephen Myers is a minister who will not necessarily listen when his department says, oh no, that's more trouble than it's worth. I am going to give Stephen the benefit of the doubt at this point and say, I think you should all write to the new environment minister and tell him how excited you are.
That is really great to hear, Lynn. So thank you. We're just past 8 o'clock. This has been a really interesting session, and this is going to be some very interesting legislation. And if it passes, I think it can make a huge amount of difference. It can be a catalyst for a lot of different changes on Prince Edward Island. So that is very cool, Lynn. And thank you very much to everybody who's participated tonight and given up a little bit of your evening. I hope it was a good exchange. If you enjoyed this, and this is the third Outside the Rail session that we've had, and they've all been really interesting. We have 3 more sessions coming up. So next Wednesday, we're going to have Steve Howard. He's our energy critic, and he's got 2 bills going forward to modernize the way we do electricity on Prince Edward Island, which is really critical to reducing our carbon emissions and having a more sustainable energy grid. So that's going to be really interesting. Next Thursday, we've got Trish Altas. She also has 2 bills that are related to her health portfolio. So one about creating accountability framework between the Minister of Health and the Deputy Minister in Health PEI, and also around the clarifying access to information about loved ones in care. And then the week after that, on the 17th of February, we have Ola Hammerlund, who's, I know, joining us on the call today. And Ola is doing a bunch of work on net zero buildings. He's done this professionally as an architect in his architect days, and he is working on this issue as an MLA now. And so he will be talking to us about why he thinks that net zero buildings are one of the key components of a sustainable future. So lots of interesting stuff to come forward. Oh, I see Sally is reminding everybody, if you're a member of the Green Party of Prince Edward Island, please complete your membership survey sent out this week. That's really important for us to have your feedback on the party itself, as well as on the bills that our MLAs are working on, because we're the work that we do at the party level is what helps to get these great people like Lynn elected. And if you're not a member of the Green Party of Prince Edward Island, why not consider joining? If you support the work that Lynn and our other MLAs are doing, a great way to be a part of that work and support it is to join the party. And you can do that very easily on our website at peigreens.ca. And yeah, so with that, I'll wish everybody a very, very good night. Hope to see you tomorrow or next week. And we will follow up as soon as we have some tools that we can provide you around this legislation and how you can do some advocacy in your spare time. Make this happen. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all so much. Good night.